show. And today my special guest is Becky Diamond, and she is an author and a librarian. And should I say historian also, Becky?
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
She's author of a really interesting book called The Gilded Age Cookbook. And she's going to talk to us about that today. So, Becky, tell it, first of all, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. So how did you get the idea to do this book? And maybe you can tell us a little quick synopsis about it.
Sure. So this is actually my third book. Now, my
Wow.
first two books are not cookbooks per se, but they are about food history.
Okay.
And so I've been writing about culinary, history for about the past 15 years. And my first book is Mrs. Goodfellow, the story of America's first cooking school.
Uh-huh.
And Mrs. Goodfellow was actually in early 1800s Philadelphia. So she had a pastry shop and a cooking school for kind of young debutante women, a lot of Quaker influence there. And she was right near the City Tavern, like that whole location. And writing about her and really doing all that research about Philadelphia history, I found out about this 1851 dinner called the $1,000 dinner.
Right.
And this was kind of a precursor to the Gilded Age, obviously, because the
Mhm.
Gilded Age doesn't really kick off till about 1870. But
Right.
this was fine dining at its greatest. It was a 17-course feast, took 12 hours, and it was a New York versus Philadelphia kind of competition, honestly, like a Top Chef competition. And Philadelphia won, yay.
My goodness.
So
Wow.
yeah, so you know, doing those two books and doing all that research on the foods and Philadelphia and New York and all of this history along the East Coast of the US, I had culminated a series of recipes that I had taken them and then recreated them, for modern ingredients and measurements, because you can't just look at a historic recipe and make it the way that it sounds. And frankly, they're all written out like in paragraph form, and you have to really go through and figure that out. So anyway, I had blogged about them, and I thought, why not put them together into a cookbook? And that's how the Gilded Age. I became really interested in this 19th century, Gilded Age, Victorian era. They overlap there, and it's kind of my specialty now. And then there's this, the Gilded Age television show on HBO, and that really helps kind of facilitate the interest in this time frame too.
Period. I didn't know about that series. But that's really interesting because Philly is really a foodie town, and I guess we have a history of that, and that's kind of why we have a foundation of that, which is really, really interesting. I wasn't aware of that cooking school and all that history that you're talking about. So that's really interesting. So you said there was like almost like a Top Chef competition between New York and Philly way back in the 1850s.
Yeah, there actually were so these were always gentlemen of means, right? Like,
Oh, yes.
the merchant, like a Stephen Gerrard, or,
Huh?
somebody, all the money that was going back and forth between Philadelphia and New York. And they really just wanted to show off who had the most, who could put on the best dinner. So the gentleman from New York, there were several of these kind of contests in Delmonico's, especially in New York.
Yes.
So that's where the first part of this competition took place.
Uh-huh.
And then the Philadelphia men said, well, we can do even better. So come down to the restaurant was called Parkinson's, and James Parkinson was the chef. And his restaurant at the time was on Chestnut Street, right around 8th and Chestnut there.
Uh-huh.
And they called it the $1,000 dinner because it cost $1,000 to put together this feast. And
Uh-huh.
the men got there at 6 p.m. and didn't leave till 6 a.m. the next morning. So it
Oh
just
my.
was feasting, like I said, 17 courses, all paired with wines,
Huh?
fine wines at the time. And that was really fascinating to learn about all those wines. so really all of that research helped me write about the Gilded Age too, because this is what, you know, really kicked off into this whole Gilded Age era,
So
this
types
opulence.
what types of recipes were kind of their favorite types of foods in that period? Or what
Yeah,
was
well,
popular, I guess?
yeah, I mean, oysters for sure. So every meal kicked off with oysters,
Uh-huh.
usually raw oysters, on the half shell.
Mhm.
But they would also do oyster fritters and oyster stew and such. But if it was a fine dining, establishment or meal, it would have been raw oysters.
Mhm.
And then they loved to have a soup next, and turtle was the other thing that was really popular. Yeah, green turtle soup, and when I say that, I mean, like, the really large sea turtles. So, they would ships would go down to the Caribbean
Uh-huh.
and get these huge sea turtles, bring them back to the
Uh-huh.
Philadelphia markets, in New York too,
Mhm.
and they would cook a huge sea I mean, some of them were, like, 300 pounds, so that made a lot of soup,
Yeah.
and so it was often served up in restaurants. They would use every part of the turtle, though. There were different dishes. They would do turtle steaks and, other parts of the turtle. So that was really popular. When the green sea turtle became over consumed, then they moved into terrapin. So that was like a smaller turtle.
Huh?
That was really popular. Game dishes, like small game birds were
Oh,
really
yes.
popular, like pigeon and snipe and all those smaller birds.
Mhm.
And just the other thing that they really liked were cold dishes, and when I say that, I mean like an aspic. That's what we would think of
Yes.
today, that
Uh-huh.
isn't really popular, like, but and not even jello like we think today. Like, it would be a clear gelatin mold.
Uh-huh.
So cold cooked food set in a cold, like a gelatin mold, and so they
Uh-huh.
would look very ornate, and they would make designs out of these dishes. And just, I mean, think about as over the top as you can imagine for these
Uh-huh. So
dishes.
they were
It's
all
just
the
crazy.
you're talking about dishes now for people that were of well means, people that were wealthy, all these types of, yes, these types of dishes. Any specific types of desserts that they went for?
Yeah, I mean, desserts were really popular too, obviously. And it's really interesting, the Gilded Age. Actually, there were several inventions, and I have a whole chapter on kitchen innovations, because
Uh-huh.
that's the thing with the Gilded Age. It was a time of innovation and technology. I mean, really, I always say the Gilded Age was built by the railroads, because it was because of the explosion of the railroads that, number one, we had these railroad industry barons,
Mhm.
plus foods could travel now further distances, and you could get foods that might be out of season, or that weren't necessarily available near where you lived. So people, say in St. Louis, could now get foods that might be typically East Coast food. So that was a big part of it. And the egg beater
Huh?
and baking powder and baking soda were two inventions that changed the game for desserts, because before the invention of baking powder,
Mm.
you had to use yeast or eggs to make baked goods rise. And you would have to really whip the eggs into a foam to make the cake rise. So typically a servant would be given that job. It could take almost like an hour to
Mm.
whip the eggs the way they needed to. Like, now we have our stand mixers that just, do such a good job. But
Exactly.
so between that and the rotary egg beater
Mhm.
really helped, facilitate these tall layer cakes that came in, that were all the rage during the Gilded Age, like sponge cake.
Mhm.
And there's another cake I had called Dolly Varden cake, which was really popular. So a lot of cakes, and also like sugar sculptures. That would be like a pastry chef would have to put that together. But like sculptures made out of like sugar and cake, and other like spun sugar, like just these ornate sculptures. Frankly, it was crazy. So that was popular, and you wouldn't necessarily eat them, but they would be on the table.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, and then puddings and pot, the typical, the ones that we think of. They
Right.
also liked ices and ice cream now, and that meant if you had ice cream,
Uh-huh.
that you were somebody of means, that you had access to ice and refrigeration, because that's the other thing that really came into play in this 19th century period is refrigeration. First the ice box, and
Hmm.
then after electricity, they actually had refrigeration. So yeah, so
That's
the
interesting.
more
It's
money you had, the better. Yeah.
the better, yes. And it's so interesting. A lot of the things we take for granted, like ice cream and all these other things, you just think that you don't realize that they were really from the people that had to have means to have that way back. And that's really interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess, yep, the railroad and all that really was a big influence, came into play into everything that was then available,
Yeah.
became available to everybody. That's really interesting. So are you doing
Yeah.
Yeah, are you doing any history on, well, with all this history now that you have? And it's so interesting because, as I said, now I understand the foundation of Philly being and New York being such foodie towns, which I think that comes from all that foundation, all that history then that we have with food. And I'm sure you found.
Yeah. Absolutely. And people don't realize a lot of times that Philadelphia was actually the food capital of the US
It
before
really.
New York. I
Oh,
mean, it's older,
uh-huh,
and um it was a port city,
uh-huh,
and Philadelphia's Market. So Market Street is named that for a reason. Well, it used to be High Street. That's what William Penn wanted to, named it.
uh-huh.
But then it became Market Street, and it's still this wide street, right? This
Right,
really
yeah,
wide,
yeah,
because they used to block it off
uh-huh,
from the Delaware
uh-huh.
down to, I'd say, at least where 8th, 9th, 10th Street is now.
Hmm.
That was all blocked off 2 days a week. And vendors were lined. They even had these market sheds. And luckily, where Philadelphia is located, like to the west was Lancaster and all the Pennsylvania Dutch or German,
Right.
farms with the dairy products. They would bring those in to the
Hmm.
markets, and being a port city, they could get imported goods. And then New Jersey had a lot of garden, other, produce areas. So people would come from all over the country at the time to see these markets. They were beautiful, like they were very pristine and clean. Like when I did all the research, they were over and above any of the other city markets in the US at the time.
Hmm.
So it really helped Philadelphia become this food
Yeah.
capital, and then New York did eclipse it. I think mainly because New York, just so many immigrants came into New York,
Yes.
after
Yes.
the potato famine, and
Yes.
then with the Gilded Age, and there's all these mansions there, and Philadelphia and New York just kept growing, uptown, it just kept extending itself uptown. And
Yeah.
so but I still think Philadelphia has so much. It's a great food
It
town.
it
So
it is. It is. And I always say, because I travel a lot for what I do for book signings and things like that. But I always just notice that wherever I'm at in the country, I always miss. I mean, I miss Philly for many reasons, but I miss the food and everything that you get here, that it is not that easy in other parts of the country, even to get that kind of food. So yeah, it still is a really great food town, definitely. And I guess it is because we have that foundation of being that way in history. Well, that's really interesting. Any just we're almost out of time, but like what did they do for, say, Christmas holiday? Any special
sure.
menus or anything? I'm sure that during the Gilded Age they had a lot.
Yeah, they, and I have a whole section of holidays in the cookbook from, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and then into 12th night, because that was also a big deal for that time frame to celebrate
Right.
that time.
Right.
But for Christmas, it was really important to celebrate Advent, and
Uh-huh.
so they would do a plum pudding, and you would get your plum pudding ready, like starting in the beginning of Advent,
Uh-huh.
and you would stir it up. They even had, it's called Stir Up Sunday, where you would mix it up and then kind of put your pudding aside and let it, settle, and all the flavors kind of meld together. So that was really important. Every Christmas dinner table had a plum pudding. They would do turkey or goose for their meal. It was often a multi-course affair, different than today.
Mhm.
And again, they would have like the oysters, and um, also other types of fish might have been served,
Uh-huh.
not just the turkey or
Right.
goose. And of course, desserts, just like we do today. But the plum pudding was the highlight for sure.
Do you think
Um,
that it sounds like did the British have an influence, like were people that came over? Because plum pudding, you mentioned Stir Up Sunday. I'm pretty sure they do something like that in the UK where it's Stir Up Sunday and plum pudding is a big part of their Christmas table. And also serving in courses is a European thing. It's not an American thing. So,
Right. You're right on all counts. That's
oh, okay.
absolutely, and Stir Up Sunday, I think it really originated in the Anglican
Uh-huh.
church kind of, and then when people came over to America, and then it became the Episcopal Church, but other churches, would celebrate this Stir Up Sunday. It was, I think it was the fourth Sunday before Advent, really is what it means. And it was that Sunday in church, but then you would go home and the whole family would take part in stirring up the plum pudding.
Pudding.
Um, yeah, so
That's
and there are a lot of European influences, British and German too. For Christmas, a lot of German influences, from the Christmas tree to a lot of the baked goods, the gingerbread, and all those things. So all the
yes.
sweets that we really like to have. So
Exactly,
yeah,
exactly. Oh, that's great. And you do have recipes in this book, the Gilded Age cookbook? I guess so, because it's a cookbook. Yes. So people
yeah.
can find out, get some recipes and try some things that you've updated, right? That were similar.
Yeah, and that's the really great thing about it, is that none of the all these recipes are very accessible,
Uh-huh.
and I made sure of that,
Uh-huh.
that they are Gilded Age, in that they are authentic from that time frame, but I have updated them. I've done all that test work and made sure that, the ingredients can be sourced today and they're the right measurements and that sort of thing. And they really aren't difficult. There are a couple, like there's a rabbit recipe that my friend Adam Diltz, he's the chef at Elwood Restaurant in Fishtown. He contributed that one. And then there's a crown roast of lamb that's a little more complicated, but for the most part, you could make a lot of these. That's the point. I want people to be able to duplicate that, and
Yeah,
use their china that they have handed
exactly.
down from their heirloom, from their grandparents or whoever, whatever you have on hand, use it, because
Uh,
it's just sitting in your china cabinet, gathering dust.
Exactly. I
So
think we're all guilty of that. Yes, but it's so nice to do like a special dinner and bring out the china, which is good to do during, especially even during the holidays. So, all right, great, Becky.
yeah.
So, where can people find this cookbook and your other cookbooks? Do you have a website?
I do. So it's www.beckyldiamond.com. So that's L as in Larry in the middle. Um, and my book is available at a lot of local bookstores. He, from here in Bucks County in Philadelphia, I'm going to be doing a book signing at the Barnes and Noble there, December 9th. Um, it's on Amazon, all the places you can think of that have books will it should be available. So
Great. So yeah, for those that are not in the Philadelphia area, you can find it on
mhm.
Amazon, Barnes and Noble. That's great. Becky, thanks so much for being here and much success with the cookbook. Really, really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome.